Evening, folks.
Good evening, kids.
We've got another speaker's corner tonight. What do you think? They just keep on rolling. Dr. John Frim is a biophysicist with years of work experience in various prestigious institutions in Canada and the US. His previous speakers' corners have been on hypo and hyperthermia. He's going to keep us healthy and enjoying our lives here in the Odyssey. Tonight's talk will be no different. And another benefit of the talk is that he's going to talk about how to maintain, well, I was right, your equilibrium when you're drunk, so that you can walk that line so that the officers don't know you're drunk. So, Dr. John Frim, pitch, roll, yaw, and why they make me sick. Come on, John.
Thank you. If Monica wouldn't have me on such a tight budget, I would have paid more people to come, but thanks for showing up. So, the talk is on motion sickness. I'm not an expert in motion sickness, but I worked at a place that had a fair bit of expertise. Just to outline what I'm going to present, I will tell you a little bit about me, why I'm doing this talk, and we'll talk just briefly about ship motion so that you know why this ship is causing problems for a few people. And then we'll get into what motion sickness is, why it happens, and how you can manage it. And I have to say I'm managing it quite well. I consider myself quite sensitive to motion sickness, and I've had very little trouble since Belfast. So, who is John Frim? Well, I worked at the Defence and Research Development Canada, which is our lab that provides scientific advice to our military primarily, but also other agencies that might need some of our expertise. DRDC is spread across several laboratories across the country. We have DRDC Atlantic and DRDC Pacific, and it would be no surprise for you to hear that they concentrate on maritime problems. In fact, my last boss that I had when I was in Washington, he was a propeller head, so to speak. He worked at DRDC Atlantic, and his specialty was propeller design to avoid cavitation and quiet operation and that sort of thing. DRDC Suffield is out in Alberta. It's out in the boonies. They have hundreds of square miles of nothing. That's where they do explosives. They do chemical defense using live agent, biological warfare, and mainly protective against it. That's what they do. The British actually come out here every year and train in that area because Britain doesn't have the open space and facilities that we have in Suffield. Valcartier in Quebec, they focus mainly on weapon systems like ballistics, so they can do rifles and bullets and what kind of damage they do, how fast they travel, all that sort of neat stuff, and also a little bit of vehicle research. Ottawa is our capital city. That's also the headquarters for our agency. That facility, the research part of it, primarily does electronics, communications, and some operational research with sort of humans and how they plan tactics and whatever. The crown jewel in the organization is in Toronto, and that's where I worked. So, DRDC Toronto had the responsibility for the human in the environment, and the environment in the broadest sense. You might think of heat, cold, that sort of thing comes easy, but the environment includes psychological issues and all kinds of things like that. So it's much broader. But not to diminish the land environment, we had environmental chambers that could get quite hot and quite a bit of humidity. We also had the capability of being very cold, minus 58 Fahrenheit, with a 30-mile-per-hour wind. And I did a lot of work for the Canadian Forces on developing and testing the current Canadian Forces Arctic Clothing Ensemble. And I also did a lot of work on heating and cooling garments to keep people cool in hot environments, like pilots who are flying in a high-performance jet. If they are in danger of a chemical threat environment, or even if they are flying over open water, they have to wear protective clothing, and that clothing keeps them encased. There's air conditioning in the cockpit, but if the body is producing heat and you're inside this suit, it's insulating you a lot, and you cannot get your body cooling very effectively. So we looked at liquid-cooled underwear for pilots, for helicopter pilots. I also did a study. I was just telling Kit how I was very sick on one of our Canadian Forces ships because we were looking at personal cooling for the people that work in the engine room. On our military ships, there's a section called the Citadel, which is filtered air, and that's where most of the occupants are, the bridge and all that. That's all clean filtered air, but the guys who are working in the engine room, there's so much air being taken in by that space that they cannot air condition that space. And if there is a chemical threat, then, or biological threat, those people have to wear very enclosing suits. And temperatures in there are certainly getting up to the 120 degrees Fahrenheit. And these guys are cooking, so we looked at cooling garments for them to work. We also looked at problems with the sea environment. We have a dive chamber which is designed and can withstand 5,000 feet of seawater pressurization. So what they do is put people into the chamber and they compress the air inside the chamber to simulate what happens when you go down to depth. Did a lot of work on decompression sickness and treatment of decompression things. Saturation diving is an interesting field. This is for people that are going down and working undersea for an extended period of time. And experiments quite often involved putting subjects in these chambers, and they were in there for 1 week to do the experiment, and it took 3 weeks to decompress and come back to a normal surface pressure. A lot of work on dive tables, dive computers, and even ultrasonic monitoring of bubbles forming in the blood. The objective of that is that ultimately you'll have a device that goes on your body and it will tell you when you are starting to get decompression issues, and you go down a few feet and then you come up a little bit more slowly, and you may behave differently than the next person beside you. So this will be a very individualized thing. That's the kind of work they did. On the air side, we have an altitude chamber that can simulate the low pressures that you get up to 100,000 foot altitude. So we were looking at things like what happens to a pilot in a high performance aircraft. He's flying at 80,000 feet and suddenly his canopy is damaged. So he is now exposed to an 80,000 foot altitude. And they have what's called positive pressure breathing systems, which squeeze the chest and they put high pressure oxygen into your mask. And it's only a get me down system. It only has to operate for about 1.5 minutes, because by that time the aircraft can descend down to 40,000 feet, and then you can breathe normal oxygen at 100%. But all of that research was done in that chamber. We also have a human centrifuge where you can put people on and spin them around and study the effects of extra G like you have in a high performance aircraft. Our lab actually had the first centrifuge, first human centrifuge in the Allied countries after World War II. And the G-suit that you may have heard about, all pilots wear these things when they're flying these high performance jets. The G-suit was actually invented by Wilbur Franks at our lab. We also did motion sickness work there. I didn't get involved in these experiments myself, but they had something called the precision angular mover, which is a fancy name for a chair that they could spin you in any direction they wanted. You can ask Monica about that. She volunteered because she said she doesn't get motion sickness, and we proved her wrong. We also did a lot of work there in different drug combinations to combat motion sickness, working with NASA. So, like I said, I never was a test subject. I think I've got lots of experience with motion sickness, so we'll carry on. So what are the ship motions we're looking at? I mentioned a couple of them earlier. So far the ship's been doing really well. I haven't experienced anything really bad. We had a tsunami and we hope it's going to be smooth sailing from there on. So there are 6 degrees of freedom. You heard pitch, roll, and yaw. Those are the ones around the axes, the rotational, and there's also surge, heave, and sway, which are linear motions of the ship. And all of these can happen at the same time. The ship can be involved in all 6 of these motions. And if this works, we're going to have a little show of what it is. So there's pitch. That's front and back of the ship. Roll is to the side. Heave is up and down. And then you get surge. That's like surfing a wave. Yaw is the spinning sideways. And sway is just plain lateral movement. So with those 6 motions, there's a lot of potential for movement. And this is what is going to be the cause of motion sickness. So what is it? Technically it's kinetosis. If it doesn't have a Latin name, it's not important, so they call it kinetosis. And it's also known as travel sickness or mal de mer. The French always have a term for something. Makes it sound a little more exotic. But 33% of people are actually quite susceptible to motion sickness. And 80% of people are susceptible to medium to high stimuli. And this is where Monica came in. She didn't think she'd get sick. I got sick in cars, buses, boats, trains, whatever. Monica was never feeling it, and so she thought she'd be a good candidate in those experiments. And she found out differently. If the stimulus is strong enough, you can get anybody sick. Now, the most common forms of motion sickness: air sickness, of course, flying in an airplane; car sickness when you're driving in a car, usually as a passenger; and seasickness, what I'm feeling or what a lot of us feel here on the ship. Less common are things like simulator sickness, so amusement rides which try to simulate things, spinning you around. Ferris wheels are fairly innocuous, but I do not do well on anything that spins around in a circle, and even roller coasters, not my favorite. Virtual reality goggles, which are very popular now with video games, can induce some kind of sickness. And pilots who are flying flight simulators. All commercial pilots have to do a certain number of hours of simulator training every year. I believe the simulators are getting better now, but it used to be that if you were in a flight simulator, you could not fly an aircraft for 12 hours because the experience in the simulator is not perfect. It's not as good as the real world. And so you have to take a break and let your body get out of that simulator mode so that you can actually fly the aircraft. And then we have space adaptation syndrome. 40 to 80% of astronauts get sick. You might think that they're selected for this because they don't get sick, but it's actually a lot of training in simulators and in something called the vomit comet, which that's an airplane that flies what they call parabolic flights. So they go up and down in a sine wave like this, and for about 25 seconds as you go over the top and down the other side, you are weightless. And you've seen these pictures on TV with people floating around, and then when the bell goes, you have to get ready because you're going to slam into the side of that aircraft. And the inside of the aircraft is basically all padded. But through training and habituation, the body does get used to these things, and that's how they try to avoid motion sickness for them. So the symptoms, if anybody's experienced motion sickness, it's pretty easy. You feel nausea, sweating, dizziness, fatigue, pale skin, increased salivation. I added the last 2. I feel I have to use the bathroom more often, and I tend to feel burping. I think it's the upset stomach that bothers me, and I find that I'm burping a lot when I get motion sick or start to feel motion sick. Ultimately, that's the end point. That's what we try to avoid. It's not comfortable. I do notice for myself, if I do go through the process of vomiting, I feel greatly relieved for a few seconds after. And then it starts over again. The cycle just starts to repeat. So what is the explanation? The best explanation so far is sensory conflict theory. We have a visual system that tells us where we are in the environment, and it also tells us things about motion that we might be experiencing. We see that we are moving. We have another important system, and that's the vestibular, and you've heard about this. Rick talked about it for hearing, but inside the ear there is the balance mechanism, and Charlie was talking about the balance mechanism in terms of walking, tripping, falling. It's very important for maintaining your orientation and also sensing motion. So these two systems, they combine their information in the brain. And the brain takes these two bits of information and it tries to rationalize them. And if they're in agreement, that's great. And most of your life, as you've been growing up, as you've been experiencing things around you, when you move your head in a certain way or your body in a certain way, you get a particular visual sensation and you get some signal from your inner ear, from the balance mechanism. And those two, you've learned how to put them together, and everything is great. Now, when those signals don't match, when they don't agree with each other, you have, for example, you're in a room, like say in your cabin, if you don't have an outside window, and you feel the cabin moving, but your visual field says nothing's changing. So we have a mismatch. And you can get the opposite in the visual simulators. In these VR simulators, your vision field is moving, but your body is not. So both ways will cause this conflict. And when that happens, your brain goes, now it's not what you think. Was that food? Because vomiting is explained by the poison theory. And motion sickness is actually an evolutionary accident to protect the body against toxic materials. So in many animals, toxin ingestion will trigger the vomiting center to get rid of something that you've ingested. The nervous pathways that are stimulated by the vestibular mismatch act on the same system in the brain as the pathways that come from ingesting a toxin. Something is upsetting your stomach, it affects the nervous system, and the body says, I gotta get rid of this stuff. And so that's what happens. It's this sensory conflict that is misinterpreted by the brain to say, you've just ingested something that's not good for you, and it's gonna throw it out. So there's a bunch of risk factors that have been found for motion sickness: age, gender, genetics, some medical conditions affecting the inner ear, also things like migraines and some diseases, and a few other factors. So let's look at the first one, age. Motion sickness is rare in children who are under 2 years of age. And that doesn't surprise me. They just spent 9 months floating around in a liquid bag, turning up and down and around and whatever. So for the first couple of years of a person's life, they're starting now to experience other things, and after about 2 years, things start to get a little more sensitive. So the susceptibility has been found to increase, and it peaks between the ages of about 7 to 12 years. And I can tell you, I got sick many times riding on buses when I was a kid in that sort of age range. Cars were pretty bad, but buses in particular. My mother used to bundle me up for the winter. I had all this clothing around me, a scarf over my face, and it was hot in the bus, and I couldn't take it. I threw up many times on buses. It generally declines through adulthood into old age, and normal aging will of course reduce the sensory functions themselves and the responses. And then there's the habituation, again, the ability of the brain to adapt. And we are very adaptable with lots of repeated exposure. we can start to ignore the signal. Same goes with the vision system itself. If you've heard of floaters in the eye, people get these little pieces of crystalline material floating in the eye, and after a while you learn to ignore them. When I first detected them in my eyes, I constantly swatted at this fruit fly that was right here. And no matter where I looked, that fruit fly was always there. And it took me a while to realize what was happening, and went to the optometrist, and sure enough, I had a few floaters there. So the body does get used to it, and I no longer swat that fly. So there are critical periods for the development of the sensory systems in the body. And I'm going to tell you about some interesting studies now that were done in the 60s and 70s with cats. I hope the cat lovers in here don't get upset with me. I didn't do the work. And back in the 60s and 70s, we weren't quite as sensitive to animals' well-being. I would say they did a few experiments that you probably wouldn't be doing today anymore. This one wasn't overly harmful or nasty. But what they did is they took kittens actually, and they divided them into two groups. And they raised these kittens in environments that were either vertically oriented or horizontally oriented. In fact, the handlers, the people that were helping these kittens and raising them, actually wore suits that had black and white stripes in the right orientation. So the kittens grew from sort of 3 weeks to 3 months of age, and that's all they ever saw, either vertical or horizontal lines. And the results were pretty astounding. The cats that were raised in a horizontal environment could easily detect horizontal lines. They could jump up on a chair very easily, but they bumped into the legs of the chair. They couldn't see the vertical legs. And as you'd expect, the other group was the opposite response. So if they were raised in the vertical, they could see the chair legs, they couldn't find the top of the chair. So that tells us that there is some learning going on, some sensory development. The neural junctions and the functions of the brain have to come together and learn, and they actually won the Nobel Prize in physiology for that work. It was pretty important stuff. They did lots more studies. Again, like I said, you wouldn't do that today, but it was very important. And it basically confirmed that stimulation is actually necessary for sensory development. And there's lots of other human senses that are developed over time at different critical periods of development. So hearing comes in from birth to about somewhere between 3.5 and 7 years is when your hearing system gets developed. And I think that would explain quite nicely why language learning is easy for children. Up to about 7 years of age, if you learn a language, you don't have an accent because you can learn it really well. After that, it takes a lot of practice to avoid an accent in your foreign language. Touch apparently develops already in the womb and gets refined over the first decade of life. Smell apparently is already well developed at birth, and in fact babies can identify the mother just through the sense of smell. That's interesting as well. I believe you would say there are pheromones involved here. Just a little thing I found out about pheromones. They are the sexual attraction smells, which you don't necessarily recognize. You don't know that they're there. They're kind of subliminal. And what I read was that siblings actually have pheromones that are unpleasant to the other sibling. And that's, I guess, to keep you from marrying and reproducing with your own siblings. So you want to diversify. So taste, birth to about 4 months is when the taste system gets developed, and it was suggested that perhaps the acceptance of a lot of nutritious foods could be improved if children had samples of this earlier on. If you keep them on a very bland diet for the first 6 months, 8 months, they might not be receptive to other tastes. And of course the balance system, which is responsible for your motion sickness response. It's pretty well structurally complete, but the central connections to the brain need that reinforcement, the practice, the exposure. And that goes all the way up through preschool years. So children learning how to crawl and then learn how to walk and balance. All of this gets developed over that period of time. And vestibular stimulation through movement and play is actually critical to the suggestion that maybe kids need a lot of time on a playground. Maybe they should be on swings. Maybe they should be spinning around on these things. Then the body will learn what these signals are, and the brain will learn how to cope with all of that. So all of these are good things. So again, it shows the neuroplasticity of the brain. The brain is very adept at adapting to different environments. Risk factors. It's been found that women in general are more sensitive to motion sickness than men. That again does not agree with Monica and my response, but that's a general statement. Hormonal factors come into play. Menstruation and pregnancy are periods of higher sensitivity to motion sickness. And pregnancy, of course, you want to be careful with any anti-motion sickness drugs that you might be taking. Genetics has been found to play a factor in motion sickness, clusters in families, and there are actually specific variants in the DNA near the genes where inner ear development, neurological processes associated with balance and glucose homeostasis are all in the genes, and the motion sickness variants are in that area. So there seems to be some suggestion that even the genetics can play a role. Medical conditions that might predispose: if you suffer migraine headaches, particularly what they call a vestibular migraine. I get the occasional migraine headache, much less now in older age. I used to get them a little bit more frequently, so that would go along with me being sensitive to motion sickness. There's other vestibular disorders. Benign paroxysmal positional vertigo is an interesting one. Little particles that are in your inner ear system become dislodged, and they get into the fluid of the inner ear canals, of the inner ear, the circular, semicircular canals. And then when you move your head, these particles start to move, they brush against the little hairs in there, and your body detects an unusual sort of motion that you're not familiar with. And so it can cause vertigo and sense of spinning and whatever. And then there's, of course, any disease that affects your motor control and your postural stability is going to be a problem for possibly motion sickness. Other factors, certainly anxiety, expectation. When I got on an airplane, I was afraid I was going to get motion sick. I took pills before flying, and then one day I had a trip that involved actually 5 hops as the plane went from the east coast of Canada to Toronto. And we weren't in the air very long. You know, as soon as the plane got to altitude, it started coming down again. And when the plane came down, I felt relieved. I think it was psychological. I knew that, we're finally getting there. I'm not going to feel this anymore. And after those 5 flights, I didn't have any problem on the 5th one at all. And one day I forgot to take my pill before flying, and I was okay. So I got used to it, and planes don't bother me anymore at all. Previous experiments, the history of motion sickness increases your likelihood, and even ethnicity appears to have some sort of a factor in sensitivity to motion sickness. So how do we avoid it? Most of these measures are behavioral in a way. If you're on a bus, pick a window seat so that you can see out. Seeing the horizon is obviously very critical. I think most people know that. If you're in a car, sit in the front passenger seat. I've never gotten sick driving a car, but I have felt sick as a passenger. And how the person drives is very important. People who accelerate quickly, stop quickly, that throws me off. If you drive gently, I can handle it much better. On a boat, you want to be in the middle. And I think Charlie mentioned this as well, the center of gravity of the system. where it's going to rock and tip and roll and twist. There's a point near the center of that vessel, whether it's a ship or a cruise ship, a boat, small boat. That's the place you want to be if you're sensitive, because then you don't get the extremes of the motion. In an airplane, if you sit in the wing section, of course, when the plane is flying and tipping up and down, the wing is the stable part. The best thing is lie under the shade under a tree. That's definitely the way to treat and avoid motion sickness. So, preventative measures. There are drugs. There are certain foods that you can eat that minimize or help reduce. There's some technologies like glasses, C-bands, and even electronic devices you can get to minimize it. And then even virtual reality, which can induce motion sickness, might be usable to prevent or reverse motion sickness. Did I mention lying under a tree? Yeah. So some of the drugs that are used for motion sickness, a lot of people are probably familiar with some of these. Meclizine, Bonine, brand name, Dramamine. I take the Gravol when I feel really bad. Scopolamine, I've seen people on the ship with the patch behind the ear. That is a slow release of the drug. And I'll tell you my experience with it that was kind of interesting. On this study that we did with one of our Canadian ships, where I couldn't do a presentation about it, my technician had to do the talk of what we were going to do with the people on board the ship for a week of experiments. And so for that week I was not feeling well, but I had the patch on, and my technician did as well. We get to Puerto Rico, and we said, okay, we're here. We're done with the ship. We can now take this patch off. You're not supposed to have it on too long anyway. So we took it off and got into the shower the next morning in the hotel, and I closed the curtain, turned the water on, and I started rocking. I felt like I was on the ship. I went to breakfast, and Robert said, you know what happened to me in the shower? I said, yeah, I know. We flew home on the weekend. I went to work Monday, I went to work Tuesday. Wednesday morning, that day when I got in the shower, I did this. And I said to Robert, you know what happened to me this morning? He says, yeah, I know. We both had the same experience. I guess it was withdrawal symptoms from the drug. But it was really funny that both of us had the exact same experience. Having taken the patch off on a Friday night, on Wednesday morning, we felt this motion sickness again, just in the enclosed space of the shower. It didn't bother me anywhere else. But when I didn't have a nice big visual field to know where my body is, and then for some reason turning the water on just accentuated that. Oh, sorry, there were a couple of others there I wanted to mention. There are things like promethazine, which are a little bit more powerful. They require a prescription in most places. The thing to remember is that you have to get something that makes you sleepy. The non-drowsy formulas are not as good as formulas that make you drowsy. Now, they do make drugs that have extra added ingredients that's supposed to counteract the drowsiness, but the actual effective drug is one that makes you drowsy. And it's definitely best taken before the onset of symptoms. So, non-drug foods and behaviors, ginger supposedly helps, ginger ale. Green apples, I was told by the doctor here on board when I was not feeling well one day. They told me to eat green apples. Chamomile tea and peppermint oil seem to be beneficial. And then again, habituation. If you get exposed gently over time, you start to accept the motion. Somehow the brain says, yeah, there's a mixed signal here, but I'm not going to let it bother me. It's that simple. And don't forget to lie in the shade under a tree. Now there's some geeky approaches. I'd love to see somebody wearing these. I've never seen them. I saw them online. I'm not going to spend the money and buy them, but I'd love to see somebody wearing them and know if they actually work or not. The science says they don't really work. The theory behind them is that it gives you a stable horizon line, but it's not actually a horizon line because each of those cells is going to be working independently. So at best you're going to get a stepped horizon line, which I don't know, I suspect it might actually make you sick. C-bands, which I tend to wear. A lot of people I've seen wearing the C-bands. I know Rose, who was the singer, the entertainer that we had for several months. She felt very bad until she took the C-bands. And Stephen Saris, one of our residents who used to be a ship's doctor, he says it's the only thing that really works effectively over the long term. So I've been using them, and although I'm a scientist, I know how to do experiments. I'm not taking them off to see if I get sick. They work for me so far. Whether they work or whether it's my head that's being screwed with and I'm just comfortable now, I don't know, but they seem to be effective for me. There's an electronic version of the similar sort of technology, or same principle. Electrical pulses are sent to the nerve in the wrist, and that travels to the brain and somehow blocks the vomiting response. And again, you can put them on even when you're feeling sick. It's supposedly, according to their literature, they actually work even after you're feeling sick. It will relieve that sickness. And they're used in morning sickness and chemotherapy as well, just to relieve that nausea. And virtual reality approaches, I mentioned that this can cause you to feel motion sick if you're using some of these virtual reality systems. I've spent a little bit of time in some of them, and yeah, I don't feel good in them, but they can also be used to help prevent. The peripheral vision horizon display, general sort of term, for a light bar that is beamed across the cockpit of the aircraft. It was called the Malcolm Horizon because Richard Malcolm was a guy that worked at our lab. Our lab used to be called DCIEM, which was the Defense and Civil Institute for Environmental Medicine. And back in the 70s, he came up with the idea of putting a beam of light across the instrumentation panel on the aircraft, and that beam of light is always horizontal. The gyroscopes make sure that it represents the horizon, so the pilot doesn't have to continually stare at the little attitude indicator. The peripheral vision will see this bar of light, and you can be looking out the window of the aircraft. And it was actually incorporated into the SR-71 Blackbird as an aid in refueling. If you know the Blackbird, that's that supersonic plane that the US had developed. What I heard at the museum when I saw it was that the fuel tanks on that aircraft would leak until the aircraft got up to altitude and got heated by flying through the air. So that's when the tanks would expand and they would seal. So those airplanes took off with less than a full tank of fuel, and they had to fuel in the air. And the Horizon was to help them keep their aircraft stable while they're doing the refueling from a tanker. Heads-up display for pilots. They now have displays that come right up. Whoops, I keep hitting that button. It comes right up in their helmet display, so they get a lot of information there. You can get the horizon and various other things. My gosh, what am I doing? I'm touching something. Motion cues on a cell phone. I don't know if you've tried this on, I have an iPhone, and there is a little thing I can activate, and it puts a series of dots around the outside of the display. And if you're driving in a car or riding in a car and you're looking at your cell phone, you're not seeing what's going on around you, and these dots reflect the motion of the vehicle. So when the brakes go on, these dots start moving upward. When the car accelerates, the dots start moving downward. And if you go left and right on a corner, these dots are moving. So while you're looking at the display and you don't have a good feel of the environment around you visually, this little display on your phone can actually show you what the vehicle is doing. And of course, don't forget to lie under the shade, under a tree. So, what behaviors can you do to reduce motion sickness? If you are in a vehicle, fresh air tends to help. Roll down the window. get those vents blowing at you. I did that in the airplane all the time. Redirect your gaze, so stop reading. Put the book down, the tablet, and look out at the horizon. Get a nice view of the horizon. I'll tell you another experience I had. I actually got motion sick in my canoe. I was out there by myself on water that was absolutely calm. It was dead still. You couldn't see a ripple anywhere. And I looked over the edge of the canoe, and the water was so clear that I could see rocks 30 feet below me. And I just got so disoriented. I put my eyes to the shore and just paddled to the horizon like that. I've also been on a boat that was coming back from Capri to the mainland in Italy, and we had people throwing up everywhere. And I was standing on the deck and I was just fine. So really interesting different responses, but keeping the view on that horizon, that really helps. Lie back, recline the seat, close your eyes. That eliminates one of the stimuli, which can lead to this confused signal to the brain. You can't do much about stopping the motion except going under the tree. Having a drink of ginger ale or ginger tea helps to settle the stomach, and you should of course maintain hydration as well. And suggestion of trying something sweet. I don't know if I'd want to have too much sweet stuff, but I could see that maybe relaxing the stomach a little bit. And then you can try the motion sickness glasses. Gosh, if anybody ever buys those glasses, let me know, because I think they look kind of geeky, but it'd be kind of interesting to see if they actually work. And take a break from anything that's causing you to get that motion sickness. I think take a break. So, on to the other topic, which is kind of interesting. Very expensive cocktails you can have to fool the cops. And this all has to do with vestibular sensation and being able to keep your balance. Ken Money was one of the scientists that worked at our lab, and Stuart Miles, he was my section head when I started working there. Back in 1974, they did a study titled Heavy Water, Nystagmus, and Effects of Alcohol. Nystagmus is a response of the eye, and it's a reflex response. You can induce it by having someone tip their head sideways and putting cold water in the ear. And what happens is the cold water causes convection currents in the ear canals, the semicircular canals, and it gives you the sensation that you're moving. And the eye reflexively will drift to a side, and when it gets to its limit, it'll snap back and it'll drift over again. That's called nystagmus. So they were looking at that response with alcohol. So we know that staggering is a side effect of having too much alcohol. And the reason it happens is that the density of alcohol is less than the density of water. Normally your body has water in certain concentrations, so the density of the fluid in the inner ear is set by your normal physiology. When you drink alcohol, then the alcohol diffuses into part of your inner ear, but not all of it. So one portion of it tends to get the alcohol sooner because of the blood flow. It's closer to the blood supply, so the alcohol gets into that part. And then if you move your head, you're getting a sensation you're not familiar with. It's out of whack with what you've grown up in terms of, when I move my head this far, I expect this kind of a sensation of motion, and it's not the same thing anymore. So the head movement causes this nystagmus, and they were able to measure that. And the vestibular signals are now in conflict with your visual and even your sense of motion, the proprioceptive signals. That's your body position. You know from the position of your muscles and joints where you should be. And when that signal gets in there as well, it just confuses the brain. So you suffer loss of balance, dizziness, and nausea. So heavy water to the rescue. Heavy water is water where the hydrogen atom are substituted with deuterium. Deuterium is an isotope of hydrogen where you add one neutron to the nucleus of the atom. So it becomes heavy. The hydrogen atom is basically twice as heavy as it was without the deuterium, without being deuterium. So this heavy water occurs in nature as about 1 molecule per 41 million molecules of regular water. But it can be filtered out, it can be obtained by some processes, and you can produce heavy water in fairly large volumes. In fact, it's used as a moderator in the CANDU, Canadian Deuterium, nuclear reactor design, where the heavy water is a moderator that slows down the neutrons and actually promotes the generation of further reactions in the reactor. It's very low toxicity, actually. It's not radioactive, and apparently it has a slightly sweet taste. So what they did is they took the density of alcohol. It's about 20% lighter than water. Heavy water is about 10% heavier than water. And if you mix it in the proportions shown, 2 milliliters of alcohol and 4 milliliters of heavy water, you'll get essentially the density of water again. So in the experiments, they gave these subjects the equivalent of about 9 alcoholic drinks. It was 2 milliliters of alcohol, 4 milliliters of heavy water per kilogram of body weight. So if you take a normal body weight, say 80 kilograms, it's a bit on the heavy side maybe, but 80 kilograms times 6, you're getting, well, just take the alcohol, 160 milliliters of alcohol. And if you work out the percentage of alcohol is usually 40% in most alcoholic drinks, it comes out to about 9 drinks that they were giving them in 450 milliliters of a drink. Blood alcohol content was about 0.18%, so they were pretty drunk. But you can walk a straight line because your balance mechanism says that's straight. So if you want to try that someday, you can try it, but it's pretty expensive. And I don't think you're going to get that cocktail here on the ship. Now, the opposite of motion sickness, you've heard of sea legs. You get your sea legs after you've been on the ship for a while. You get accustomed to the motion. It doesn't bother you anymore. So then you get off the ship and you've still got sea legs, but you're on land. And you start to feel strange sensations. Again, the French have a good term for it, mal de débarquement, disembarkment syndrome. I experienced it on this trip. We were on one of the islands, I forget which one, rented a car and had no problem driving the car. We went up to the top of a mountain and I got out of the car, started walking on a bit of a crooked trail, rocks, uneven ground, and I started feeling dizzy. I got back in the car, we drove to another spot, driving was fine, I got out and again had the same sensation. So it's a well-known symptom, usually follows a cruise or other motion experience, and if you want to check it out, Randy wrote an article on it. Check out his blog and you'll see what it's all about.
Duck Rock.
So just to summarize, it is a normal response. Motion sickness is a normal response. It says that your visual and vestibular systems are working properly. The brain has not been conditioned to ignore a problem. Now you can call that good or bad. If you learn to ignore the problem, you might say that's good. But if you have the problem, I like to think that my eyes and my ears are sending the correct signal to the brain, and the brain just hasn't figured it out yet. It's more prevalent than possibly expected. It's manageable with behavior, medication, and of course prevention. And the research is continuing on genetics, virtual reality adaptations. These are becoming so much more popular these days. And then personalized medication responses. You get a cocktail of different compounds that might be tailored to you. And that's what a lot of the work was done at the lab in Toronto with the NASA astronauts. They came up and they got personalized cocktails of the drugs so that they would not get motion sickness. And it depends on who you are, how your body reacts. You might need a little more of this and a little bit less of that. and another person would have the opposite. So, on to any questions that I might be able to answer.
How long did it take the horizontal and vertical kittens to adapt to normal life?
I don't think they did.
Is that because they were so young?
Yes. It seemed to be a bit of a permanent response. They probably can, I don't know the outcomes of the study, in detail, but some of these experiments they did, they caused permanent damage, if you want to call it that. They have lasting effects. So it's very important that you get the right stimulus at the right time. I can tell you a little bit nastier experiments if you want to know what they did. Yeah, like I said, you wouldn't do it today, but the work was very important in understanding how the body actually develops, and groundbreaking work, got a Nobel Prize.
John, I hate to tell you, wonderful presentation, really enjoyed it, but I hate to tell you there's no shade trees on the Villa Vie.
Maybe we can go
So I don't
under the
really-
mast.
That might help. My question is the technology behind the wristbands. I've never used one. I'm fortunate I very seldom ever get motion sickness, but what makes a wristband work?
Well, you have to be a believer in, I guess, the acupressure points, and that is apparently the mechanism. What little I know about acupressure, it's kind of like signal jamming. So with a little bit of pressure in the right places, you get a signal to the brain which kind of interferes with what you are getting that you don't want. Headache, apparently a little squeezing like this is supposed to relieve a headache. Like I said, whether it works or not, through that mechanism, it's working for me. And I don't think you can discount the psychological component. But that's the explanation for it. And the same with the electrical stimulus. It's doing the same thing. It's sending nerve signals. The brain is responding to those signals as opposed to saying, oh, you've eaten something that you shouldn't have eaten.
John, a little precaution on the patches behind the ear that
Yeah.
you put on. I was chief of the boat on a nuclear submarine. One of our reactor operators put on 3 or 4 of them as a joke, and so we put him in a straitjacket afterwards because he was totally unreliable and practically out of his mind.
Yeah,
Okay, it took a week before those chemicals got out of his body.
sure. Yeah, it's pretty powerful medication. It's in some kind of a slow release formula that's supposed to go into the body over a week, 7 days. They don't recommend wearing more than one, and they don't recommend wearing them for too long.
John, are you familiar with the Beaufort scale?
Yeah.
Okay, how, for people who are susceptible to motion sickness as related to the cruise, what is the strength that usually causes it?
I don't know if I could answer that directly when you say, do I know what the Beaufort scale is? Yeah, it's sort of an arbitrary number that talks about the wave heights, the wind velocity. I don't think you can actually put a number to it, because I can be perfectly fine when the ship is tossing and pitching and rolling, and another day it's barely doing anything and I will feel sick. So it's more the kind of motion, the type of motion that you're experiencing, as opposed to necessarily the intensity of it.
Thank you.
Just one more comment on the scopolamine patch. As the ship's physician, I only saw the ones that were not working. I don't know how many people had great cruises with the patch and never had a problem. I would only see the people that were having a problem. Often they would come to the med center saying, the scopolamine patch is not working. I'm terribly dizzy, I'm not really comfortable. And the treatment was to simply take the patch off, because then they'd felt fine. Often people get the symptoms of seasickness from the patch. So do consider that if you're wearing a patch.
Which in my case either was withdrawal or it was a late onset of the symptom of motion sickness, having removed the patch too. Yeah.
I have a relief band, and one time on a very small ship going between the Galapagos Islands in the middle of the night, I got seasick. I was about to vomit, but I fainted. When I came to, I put the relief band on, cranked it up full. Within 5 minutes, I was fine and went back to sleep.
Wow.
So they do prevent seasickness as well. They cure as well as prevent.
Excellent to know. I'm not likely to buy one. I think I'm old enough that my sensory system and my functional system is degraded to the point that I think before this cruise is over, I'm going to be able to ditch the bands and be perfectly fine.
I just wondered if the bands are the position that you put it, is it an individual thing? Or is there a very specific spot that you need to have?
Well, the recommendation is in the middle of the arm, between the two tendons that you can feel, and 3 fingers down from the fold of the wrist. I don't know whether that's accurate on everybody, but it's in that vicinity. And I think if you are using the bands, you're going to think they're working, and you're going to feel them working. You're going to believe they're working, and you'll be fine.
I tried them for land legs, didn't work.
Didn't work? Well, individual responses.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Okay. John, thank you very much.